It was blizzarding. Looking anxiously at the weather outside the window, the restaurant's visitors decided not to stay long. The weather forecasters promised a huge snowfall. The parking lot quickly emptied, and the last guests left by cab. The place closed earlier than usual, and Natalie couldn't help but be happy about it. Finally, there was a chance to get home before midnight as usual. A small dog of unknown breed was waiting for her at home. Last year she had picked it up on the street. Coming out of the grocery store, she took pity on the stray and fed her. The scary little mangy monster licked her hand with gratitude and followed her all the way home, not a step behind. When she reached the entrance, Natalie realized that the dog had chosen a mistress. There was no collar, and the lucky dog had found herself a mistress. Bathing, brushing, and a little haircut turned her into a very cute creature. Happy, beady eyes gazing adoringly at her rescuer and catching her every move. Natalie finally finished the last load of dishes, but Edward, the restaurant manager, had made her wash the dishes again, supposedly to find traces of streaks. There was no need for that, of course. Her immediate superior had disliked her from the start. Edward was a lanky, red-haired young man of about 35. He was king and god around here. The nominal owner had several other restaurants in the city, and this one, the most unprofitable, had been given over to an ambitious administrator, and he rarely appeared in the place. The staff was almost entirely female, and Edward liked to feel like an alpha male, grooming his pride. He often gathered them in the kitchen and told them dirty jokes. Everyone laughed loudly, respecting the chain of command. He liked to invite everyone to his office one by one and conduct, as he put it, individual training. Among themselves, the female workers whispered that everything was reduced to lewd topics. No one could leave without coming into contact with the sticky paws of the boss. Everyone tolerated it. There was no one to complain to. Edward was attracted to Natalie at first sight. His buttery eyes immediately recognized the statuesque figure that the modest clothes couldn't hide. Her small but high breasts lurked behind a spacious sweater, and the skirt below her knees only emphasized the perfect proportions of her slender body and the length of her legs. Straight, dark, russet hair of medium length glistened in a waterfall on her graceful shoulders. Precise features, lively gray almond-shaped eyes, skin as if porcelain. It was the type of face that absolutely did not need makeup. It was enough for a girl to just wash her face in the morning, comb her hair with a brush, and the attention of men all day long will not be rejected. Pedigree doll, thought voluptuously administrator, and aloud asked, and why exactly dishwasher? After all, with such appearance you should be on the lookout. Do you want to be a waitress? No, thank you, velvet voice replied the girl. I am satisfied with the schedule of work in the evening. Well, there are no unsolvable problems, murmured the man with a squint. But the new dishwasher did not react to him neither now nor later. She did not laugh with everyone at jokes, did not pay attention to greasy jokes, avoided him and deftly dodged the ubiquitous hands of the administrator. The girl's impregnability only made the boss angry, and he called her into his office. Natalie had already heard from the female employees about his filthy assaults and was ready to fight back. Edward sat her down on a chair and began to walk around in circles, talking loudly at first about the restaurant's prospects, the importance of teamwork, and the individual contributions of each employee. At the same time, as if by accident, he tried to touch her, put his hands on her shoulders and lightly touch her hair. But when he switched to a half-whisper and tried to embrace her, the girl stood up sharply. Edward, I came here to work. I'm not interested in anything else. Please make sure that this doesn't happen again. The administrator could not tolerate such a categorical refusal. All right, you'll get a job. What a queen, he thought. Since then, and began constant nagging on his part. He had to rewash perfectly clean dishes, scrub the floors and tiles again and again. Edward often threw in extra work for her at the end of the shift. She tolerated it. The pay was relatively good, but she began to think about changing jobs. Finally, everything is sorted and put away, and the kitchen is sparkling with pristine cleanliness. Edward leaves with the new waitress, and all the employees sigh with relief. Go home, Natalie. Assistant Chef Pam lets the dishwasher go at last. Instantly dressed and saying goodbye, she rushed outside. The icy wind angrily threw a whole bunch of stinging snowflakes at her, and they danced across her face, trying to bite her forehead and cheeks. The thick, frosty air crept further and further into her chest with each breath. Natalie pulled up the hood of her unattractive coat and tried to protect her face with a mitten. She decided to take a shortcut and run straight through the park. It was a little scary, it was late, but in 10 minutes she'd be able to squeeze the dog. The usual way would take almost half an hour, if she didn't have to wait for the bus for a long time, and the cost of transportation mattered. It was decided, and the girl took a quick step towards the lantern-lit park alley. After a few meters, the step had to be slowed down because of the knocking down gusts of wind and ice. The park was expectedly empty. Trees, bushes, and benches along the path were covered with snow. In the light of the street lamps, a silvery snowstorm ran. The cold penetrated to the bones, but the girl was used to it. The harsh weather brought back heavy memories. Natalie remembered her childhood like some black-and-white movie. Her parents were simple workers. Her father worked as a mechanic at the factory, her mother as a cook in the canteen. They were not intelligent. They liked to drink, and this life suited them fine. Their daughter, on the contrary, from an early age, opened a craving for science and art. Since the 3rd grade, the little girl had been missing in libraries, as there were no books at home at all. She read with a fervor, everything in a row, but her favorite activity was drawing. When she took in her hands a pencil and a blank sheet of paper, time and space around ceased to exist. At school, the girl studied well and shunned hyperactive classmates. It's not that she didn't want to be friends with them, she just had other interests. Some peers considered this behavior a sign of arrogance and began to bully her in every possible way. Natalie was offended, but she held firm and didn't respond to the bullies, only withdrew even more into herself. All these troubles ended unexpectedly in the 6th grade, when the main bully of the class, Steve, fell down next to her at the desk and loudly said, "Whoever else gets in touch with Natalie will have to deal with me." The classmates quieted down, and he remained sitting with the girl. The boy liked the beautiful and mysterious Natalie. Secretly, he admired her shiny hair, braided into thick, long braids, and her face with a perfect profile, leaning over another mysterious drawing in a notebook. In private, Steve called her princess and carried her briefcase behind her all the way home. He imagined himself as a knight in shining armor, protecting the lady of his heart from dragons and other evil things. Natalie was grateful to Steve. He had proved to be shallow and reliable. Even when she ran out of common themes, he simply walked beside her, not disturbing her creative thought, silently deifying his ideal. In high school, those around them no longer doubted that they would be together forever. Suddenly, before the start of final exams in the family, Natalie had a misfortune. In her absence, her parents burned from the gas in their own apartment. The poor girl remembered opening the door, and the pungent smell of gas that escaped from it almost knocked her off her feet. She immediately ran to open all the windows, but it was too late. The investigation revealed that the parents had been drinking and fell asleep, forgetting about the stove. Natalie had grown distant from her parents lately. They weren't very interested in her either. They were used to her independence and constant busyness. But she loved them and knew that they were very proud of her daughter. Grief piled a heavy weight on the girl, not giving the opportunity to realize and accept what had happened. Everything happened as if in a fog. From the relatives at the funeral came only the grandmother from the father's side. She grieved at the grave and hurried back. Somewhere there was waiting for her another family and a large household. At parting, she invited her granddaughter to her house, but she refused. She is already 18 and exams are coming up. So they said goodbye. Back in the deserted, shabby Khrushchevka, Natalie sat down in the kitchen. Her head was a mess, her arms were down, and she had no energy left for anything. She couldn't even cry. And then there was the guilt of being a neglectful daughter, of not appreciating her parents when they were alive. The unexpected ringing of the doorbell interrupted the self-torture. An unaccustomedly serious Steve stood on the threshold. He pulled her to him without a word and pressed her gently with both hands. It was suddenly warm and calm. Something inside her unclenched and released the accumulated streams of tears. So they stood in the hallway, embraced. The boy waited patiently, while Natalie sobbed and sobbed. Then he took her to the bathroom, washed her like a little girl, sat her down in the kitchen, and made her a strong tea. All the negative emotions went away at once. Now there was only a hot cup of sweet tea and Steve's kind look. That's how he stayed with Natalie. Life went its way. and it was time to decide on the direction of movement. The girl dreamed of doing creative work and making it her profession. But down-to-earth Steve, going through her drawings in which he knew nothing, besought his wife. Artist or designer? Is that a profession? It's a dabble. And the tuition is too expensive. Natalie sighed and guiltily poo-poo-poo-pililuya. Really study will fly into a penny. You'd better go to medical school on a budget. In a few years there will be a good demanded specialty. So we agreed. The dream remained a dream. Natalie easily enrolled in medical school at the paramedic department and enthusiastically plunged into comprehension of medical wisdom. Steve was drafted into the army and left to serve. A month later, his wife told him she was expecting a baby. Yeah. Not very timely, of course, said the man thoughtfully into the phone after hearing the unexpected news. Well, okay. We'll think of something. Everything will be fine. But they didn't have to think of anything. Soon the pregnancy was terminated. Don't cry, Natalie. We'll have more children, he reassured his wife on the phone. After returning from the army, Steve went to chauffeur. When his wife suggested that he continue his studies, he waved his hand away. You study. Come on. Maybe, sometime later. Steve got a high-paying job. He drove a businessman in an expensive foreign car. Later, however, it turned out that the new boss, the usual major. After another wrecked car and taken away driver's license, Rich Dad hired him a chauffeur. So, apparently, it was more profitable and safer. His name was Ethan, and he was only a couple years older than his driver. Between them, they quickly established a relationship of trust. Ethan was good-looking, tall brunette with a fashionable hairstyle, tenacious brown eyes, a constant smile on his face. The girls were crazy about his looks, manners, and fat wallet. Loveless with pleasure used it. He was a regular at the clubs and parties, and Steve had to drive him around in the morning. Natalie felt that such a job would do no good, but her husband didn't even want to hear her. The money was good. Having tasted the rich life, Steve changed. With his wife almost no communication, coming home just fell on the couch and turned on the TV. From his shirts clearly smelled of women's perfume, but a sense of dignity did not let the young woman to arrange a scandal to clarify the relationship. Natalie was already in her third year of college when disaster struck again. Steve was dead. It happened at dawn. The driver took Ethan from another club. On the way, they stopped at a gas station. A drunken businessman was smoking right in the cabin of the car and threw out a cigarette butt, which flew to the open gas tank. The gasoline vapors instantly burst into flames, and the flames spread to the filling car. Steve, not thinking long enough, rushed to pull out the barely conscious chief, picked him up under his arms, and tried to drag him away from the blazing inferno. But he didn't have time. The wall of flames hit him in the back and threw him several meters away. He died on the spot from the extensive burns he received, and Ethan was taken by ambulance to the hospital. The familiar world was shattered into pieces overnight, and sharp shards stabbed straight into the girl's heart. Steve was buried in a closed coffin, and Natalie suffered even more. She wanted to see her beloved husband for the last time, so much she did not have time to say to him when he was alive, so she blamed herself for the dry bye, said in farewell on the eve of his death. After the funeral, the girl just lay in bed for a few days. She did not want to see or hear anyone. Then it was as if she snapped out of her oblivion. Suddenly, she wanted to go to the place where the accident had happened. The gas station was empty. A round-faced cashier with a bored face was shifting merchandise in a small display case. Hello? You had a car explode here a few days ago. Yes, it happened. It was a hell of a mess. One man was killed, another was taken to the hospital. I was just on shift. The woman became animated and put aside her business in the hope of gossiping a little. I'm the wife of the dead man, Natalie said quietly. She shook her head sympathetically. He was such a nice guy, he always bought cigarettes from me. Natalie wiped away a tear and asked, Tell me how it was, please. I've told the police so many times. She thought for a moment, remembering the details. Well, the car pulled up. The driver, your husband, put the gun in, came to me, paid, made a joke, I think. But the other one didn't get out of the car. Then smoke started blowing and the fire was going full blast. Your husband rushed to get the passenger out, and I called the fire department and ran to get a fire extinguisher. Our fire suppression system went off belatedly, and then there was an explosion. I called an ambulance. and then it all went up in smoke. The cashier looked pityingly at the sad widow and gave out what she had been struggling with. The ambulance didn't even try to save your husband. They fiddled with that drunken passenger. I told them to save the driver. And they said, "Don't interfere, there's nothing you can do to help him." And he was still breathing. Natalie turned pale as death. These words struck her in the heart. She turned around and staggered home. The next day, after gathering her thoughts, she went to class. First on the schedule was a lecture on first aid in extreme situations. Natalie tried to make sense of the lecturer's words through the fog, but suddenly the words cut into her ear. The first thing to do is to sort the victims according to the severity of the injury, and based on that, determine the order in which they should be treated. She imagined how her burned Steve lay moaning and groaning, while the ambulance crew, not paying attention, helped his rich chief. The picture was so vivid that Natalie involuntarily shrieked, "Nonsense! It's not true!" The entire audience stared at her, and the instructor was silent, looking at the crazy student in surprise. Without a word, the girl jumped out the door and ran wherever the hell she was going, away from here. As she left the building, she didn't even look back once. Natalie knew for sure that she would never come back here again. 2 weeks later, Ethan showed up at her house. The young widow didn't really want to talk to him, but he went straight to the kitchen without asking permission. He sat down at the table and looked around with curiosity. The impudence of the guest struck the girl, and she did not know what to say. "Natalie, I came to thank you for your husband. He saved my life after all," and pulled out a puffy envelope from his pocket. The young woman instantly awoke from her stupor. "I don't need your money. Take it, please. I feel a little awkward." "No need. The money won't bring my husband back." "No need." "You are too young. You still have everything ahead of you," he began, and approaching her suddenly said in a low voice, "With your looks you can settle down well in life and leave here." He mimeographed his hands around the 5-meter kitchen. "I can help you." He had the look of a cat with a mouse in a corner. Natalie had been catching his ambiguous glances at her for a long time, and in that moment, it was very clear. Suddenly she felt sick to her stomach. She stood up abruptly, put the envelope with the money in his hands, and pointed to the door with a stone face. "Get out of here!" He stood there for a second, then shrugged and walked toward the exit. Natalie woke up from her memories, her whole previous life flashing before her eyes in just a few minutes. And here she was again, a widow for more than a year at her very young age, trudging through the blizzard, walking home, where only a dog was waiting for her. There was only one creature left in the whole world who loved her. Steve's death had knocked Natalie out of her life, and since then she had lived in a kind of prostration. All day long she drew and drew, all her emotions laying on the paper with the strokes of a pencil, and folded into bizarre and incredible images. And in the evening she mechanically washed, rinsed, wiped. She could not explain to herself how she had accepted such a job. Perhaps it was because she could forget herself and not think about anything. Suddenly, Natalie noticed that she was not alone. Almost at the end of the alley, a dark silhouette could be seen on a bench. Strange. Who was walking in this foul weather? She stepped closer. The man leaned back and sat unmoving. Jesus, is he dead? She stopped and moved closer. It was a man. Blue-black face, swollen, and age was impossible to determine. He could be as 20 and 40 years old. The stranger was alive, but he was breathing heavily. "What's the matter with you? Are you ill?" The man didn't react, just stared at one point. Natalie took off her mitten and touched his forehead. He had a high fever. When he felt the touch, he finally woke up, and with difficulty he looked at the girl. Immediately he shook wildly in a fever. Attempts to make contact failed. What to do? If left here, he would surely freeze. After a moment's hesitation, she made a decision. She crouched down and wrapped her arm around his neck, lifting him up with some effort. There were no passers-by nearby, and she couldn't count on help. The house was already visible, and perhaps a dog was watching her through the window, barking happily. There was only a short distance to go. The man tried to help in some way, moving his legs with difficulty, but it did not help much. With great difficulty I brought him to the entrance, but how to get him to the second floor? Unexpectedly, help came in the form of a neighbor on the landing. I didn't have to explain for a long time, and the neighbor was not curious. Probably he thought that the widow had finally got a man, at least such an unattractive one. The barking was ringing in my ears. She never seemed to stop barking. "Well, stop it, please. Be hospitable." Natalie tried to quiet her as she put the man on the bed. He didn't look like a completely degraded bum. His light jacket and jeans were dirty, but without the peculiar odor of a body that had not been washed in years. No identification was found. "Okay, we'll figure it out later," she thought, and ran to the drugstore. 3 courses of medical school were not in vain. The next morning the unknown man came to himself. He opened his eyes with difficulty, but he could not speak yet. After lunch the temperature began to rise and he was shaken again. The girl could not leave the patient in such a state. She called the restaurant, and the vindictive receptionist answered the phone. "Edward, can I take over today? I can't come to work." For the first time in the voice of the unapproachable dishwasher was heard a plea. "No!" An arrogant voice answered sharply. "Please. I have never once asked for or taken time off." She still tried to persuade the arrogant boss. "Today is your shift, and you must be at your workplace. You will be fired for absenteeism," she said in an emphatically formal tone. Natalie looked back at her ward, who was already delirious. "Then fire him," and firmly hung up the phone. 2 days later, the crisis was over. The man turned pink and could already talk. He looked around the unfamiliar room and the pretty nurse with amazement. Natalie was cheerful, happy about the life she had saved. "Good morning," she said with a friendly smile. "Good morning." Her voice was weak and hoarse. "Who are you? How did I get here?" "I'm Natalie. I found you in the park with pneumonia. But you're going to be all right now." "What's your name?" The stranger was silent for a long time, as if trying to remember something. "I'm sorry, I don't have the strength," and closed his eyes. Natalie was surprised by this behavior, but after all, he was too weak to know what had happened to him. Let him sleep then, she thought, and went out with the curious dog, who was trying to get to know the new tenant. By lunchtime, the landlady had boiled a light chicken soup for her patient. He ate the soup happily, but when Natalie asked his name again, he pushed his plate away and sighed. "I'm sorry. You probably won't believe this, but I don't remember anything." "How? Nothing at all?" The girl was surprised. "I remember that I was lying in some unknown place. Then I got up and walked for a long time, and then sat down on a bench." The expression of extreme confusion on his face confirmed the truth of the story. Now that he looked a little fresher despite the stubble, it was clear that he was in his 30s. Natalie wondered. At the school they had been told of cases where people lost their memory after an injury, mostly short-term. She needed to find out if anyone had gone missing recently. At the police station she was quickly dismissed. "No missing person report has been filed," summarized the young officer on duty. "What should we do? The person doesn't remember anything." "Girl, go to the doctors. We can't deal with all the homeless people in the city." Natalie remembered a friend from medical school, Mary, a volunteer. She was the kind of enthusiast who would walk through the cold, wet woods day and night looking for people or kittens. The friend immediately picked up the phone, listened attentively to her former classmate, and promised to help. After a couple more days, the stranger could already walk, but because of weakness and dizziness, the caregiver had to support him. Natalie was pleased with his slow but steady recovery, and he was grateful not to be pestered with questions. A mutually comfortable relationship had developed between them. The girl was preparing dinner in the kitchen when suddenly the guard dog barked, and at the same moment the doorbell rang. Natalie opened it. Standing in front of her was an older couple, a dark-haired, stern-looking woman in a sable coat and a balding, gray-haired man in a stylish imported sheepskin coat. The woman looked arrogantly at the landlady and introduced herself. "Good afternoon, I'm Lori, and this is my husband, Mike. We've been informed that you may have our son." "Hello." "Yes, of course. Come in. I'm Natalie." The girl was happy and opened the door hospitably. "Please, in that room over there." A thrill came over her at the thought that the unfortunate patient would finally regain his memory. It was obvious that the lady was not used to being in ordinary Khrushchevkas. She squeamishly picked up the hem of her luxurious fur coat and walked inside. Her silent companion followed her. Entering the bedroom, the woman cried out and rushed to the man lying there. "Andrew, thank God. We've been looking for you for a week." The young man looked at the lady carefully, and suddenly a smile lit up his face. "Mom?" He opened his arms. "Dad, I remember." The excitement of the meeting made a lasting impression on Natalie. What luck that she had walked through the park then. How fortunate that everything had ended well. The mother of the family regained her equilibrium and began to get busy. "All right, I'm calling the emergency vehicle from the private hospital." Mom, I'm already moving around on my own." Andrew tried to calm her down. The energetic mother of the family did not stop. "Mike, call the driver. Have him come up and help. We're getting out of here right now." While her husband obediently carried out the instructions, Lori approached the smiling hostess. "What's your name, did you say?" "Natalie." She reintroduced herself. "Ah, yes, Natalie. How did you find my son?" "I picked him up sick from a park bench," the girl replied calmly, looking her in the eye. The woman asked incredulously, "That is, you let a sick man unknown to you into your house? Why?" Natalie was surprised by this question. It seemed natural to her. "He could have died," she answered simply. Lori stared suspiciously for a while. Then she resolutely took out her purse and pulled out several large bills. "Will that be enough?" Natalie recoiled. "I didn't do it for that." The incredulous guest added another large sum. "Take it. It's a reward." Natalie only shook her head. "Thank you. No need," and crossed her arms over her chest and stood against the wall, watching the bustle and gathering of the patient. Andrew's mother gave the proud girl a skeptical look and led the company away. 4 days later, Andrew arrived. There was no trace left of that overgrown dying bum. In front of the girl stood a handsome young man, neatly trimmed and smoothly shaved, wearing his trademark brightly colored down jacket and a full-mouth smile. In his hands he held a huge bouquet of white roses with a creamy tint on the edge of the petals. "Hello, Natalie. Meet a former patient." The girl was happy to see him so radiant and fresh. Over a cup of tea, they finally got to know each other for real. Andrew was in the family business, run by his tough mother. It was a rather large chain of building stores. It turned out that the day Natalie, who had been kind-hearted, had found him, he'd been attacked in the parking lot outside the office, hit on the head from behind with something and robbed, taking his wallet and documents, his wallet and phone, and an expensive watch. Andrew eyed his selfless savior curiously. Now that the fog caused by the severe illness had cleared in his head, he was able to appreciate the beauty of the owner of the modest dwelling. The beautiful figure, the large beaming eyes on her chiseled face. Natalie had long been accustomed to male attention, but the guy's gaze was somehow embarrassing and mesmerizing. There was an awkward pause. Both of them averted their eyes in embarrassment. The silence was interrupted by Andrew. "Natalie, I don't know how to thank you for your kindness." He hesitated a little and timidly continued. "Today there is a premiere of a great movie in the theater. I have already taken tickets." For some reason, the girl did not want to refuse him. During his illness, he had become something of his own. "I haven't been to the movies in ages," she smiled. "I'll pick you up at 6. Natalie liked the movie. The light romantic comedy created a special mood. Both of them did not want to part, and Andrew proposed to have dinner in a small cozy restaurant nearby. The candlelight flickering over the tables reflected in the tall glasses and sparkled in the wine. The darkness and soft, pleasant music added to the magical atmosphere of the evening. Andrew was proud of his beautiful companion. Even in a modest, unpretentious dress and practically without makeup, the girl was the center of attention. Natalie hadn't felt so good and relaxed in a long time. The surroundings and the man sitting across from her seemed special. It was pleasantly dizzying. Or maybe it was just a glass of wine. The gallant gentleman escorted the girl to the apartment door and kissed her hand goodbye, as if an electric shock ran from the palm of his hand to the heart. "Thank you for the evening," she said quietly, opened the door and took a step into the hallway, then looked back at Andrew standing behind her. Their gazes met and guessed their own desires in each other's eyes. The man stepped toward her, took her into a passionate embrace and kissed her gently on the lips. Natalie's head rumbled. A languid negativity spread throughout her body. It seemed as if all her cells had merged into one sensual flow. Somewhere in her brain, one small cell suddenly protested, "You don't know him at all. What are you doing?" But it was immediately picked up by the others and whirled into a waltz. "Why not?" She submitted to their desire before falling into the voluptuous dance of love. Andrew was gone for 5 languid days. The waiting seemed unbearable, and Natalie, overcome by her innate pride, called him herself. The call was immediately dropped. The resentment stung her soul. The girl persuaded herself that this intimacy meant nothing, because none of them had promised each other anything. Having calmed down a little, she began to think over further plans. The events of the last few days have pulled the young widow out of a long hibernation and prompted her to dare the most incredible changes in her life. A distant dream suddenly became quite real and realizable. Everything fell into place by itself. Natalie decided to enter the Academy of Design. There were no budget places, but there was a correspondence department. All that remained was to find a job and save up for the first year's tuition. Suddenly, Andrew called. He was waiting for her at the coffee shop next door. Natalie sat down at the table across from him. This meeting was strikingly different from the last one. Running guilty eyes, hands nervously crumpling the napkin, a stammering voice. "Natalie, do you resent me much?" "I don't resent you at all." "Natalie, are you mad at me?" "I'm sorry. I didn't call and didn't come. I had to think." Natalie listened silently, anticipating further developments in the conversation. "I told my mother about you, and she was categorically against our relationship. She, for some reason, got it into her head that you were involved in that robbery. Anyway, my mother fucked my brains out these days." Natalie remembered Lori and thought, yes, that person can, no wonder. Without waiting for any reaction from the girl, Andrew finally said, "Sorry, we can't go out anymore." For a while they just stared at the cooled coffee, each in his own cup. The silence was interrupted by Andrew. "Natalie, no matter what, you will always be a close person to me. Is there anything I can do for you?" After a little thought, the girl made an unexpected request. "Help me find a job." "I can help you financially," the man fussed. "Thank you," Natalie grinned. "I'm not used to this. I just need a job." The failed fiancé suddenly remembered, "Our friends, a beautiful, intelligent family, are now looking for a maid, but only with accommodation." Natalie thought about it and decided that this option would be ideal. You can rent out your apartment and realize your dream even earlier. "It's perfect for me," she said. Hoping to be of some help, Andrew immediately dialed a number and arranged an interview for Natalie. There was no time to be sad about what had happened. Excited about the changes to come, she had to decide what to do with the dog. It was still unclear how potential owners would feel about the little annoying 4-legged collar. I had to turn to the reliable Mary again. She gladly agreed to take the little girl for foster care. Natalie promised, handing her friend the fidgety little rascal. The small cottage town in the nearest suburb was astonishing in its variety of architectural forms and styles, as well as in the imagination of the local, far from poor inhabitants. There were stone castles, ornate palaces, and even log cabins with 2 floors. The family's house differed from its fancy neighbors by its strict and laconic lines combined with incredible lightness and airiness. Andrew warned that the owners owned their own architectural design firm. Natalie was approached by a dark-haired woman in her 50s, her trim figure and pleasant facial features suggesting that she had been unusually good-looking in her youth. She smiled welcomingly and invited him indoors. The cottage looked even more presentable from the inside than from the outside. Every corner, every detail of the interior was thought out not only with taste, but also with love. In the center of the spacious living room with a 5-meter panoramic window, an extraordinary fireplace, glazed from all sides, attracted the eye. It was the heart of the family nest, in which the fire beats, attracting to itself the warmth of all the household. In a chair by the fireplace sat a solid man with gray hair at his temples. When he saw the guest, he stood up to meet her. "Good evening, Natalie," he said, smiling broadly. "I'm John, and this is my wife, Wendy." "Pleased to meet you," the embarrassed girl replied. She liked the way they talked to each other. She liked everything about the place. The owners also liked the new maid. They invited her to tell her story over a cup of tea, and Natalie told her sad story briefly but honestly. Wendy leisurely showed her around the house and told her what she wanted in a new maid. It wasn't that scary, and it was very clear. In the backyard was a guest house, small but very cozy. Here she was, offered to move in. After the city's standard box, the new dwelling seemed a paradise. "Wendy, I have a big favor to ask of you." Natalie finally decided to voice her excitement. "I have a small dog that's not at all skittish. Can she stay with me?" The hostess grinned good-naturedly. "Let's try. I don't mind. My husband loves animals." The new maid exhaled a sigh of relief and looked gratefully into the kind eyes of the woman. "What a wonderful family this is. I'm so lucky." Everything was working out just perfectly. I rented the apartment very quickly to a neighbor, good that has long been interested in this issue, wanting to settle the newlyweds, her son and daughter-in-law, separately. She quickly packed her belongings and went to get the dog. Her mood was on the upswing. Finally, her life had moved from a dead point, and only good things were ahead of her. Mary exclaimed with a concerned look. "The dog is missing. We were walking it this morning. It broke free and ran after some cat," she added, looking guiltily at her upset friend. "My boyfriend will be here this afternoon. I promise we'll find it." The unexpected news upset Natalie. What to do? Stay and look? Go home and wait? Seeing her hesitation, Mary vowed, "Go to work, don't even think about it. We will definitely find her. If not here, then we will visit your house. Don't worry, everything will be fine. We've already returned so many lost ones." After a little more hesitation, Natalie drove out of town, and late that night she was already putting her things away in her new home. At 6 in the morning the bell rang, but Natalie did not sleep. She had been sleepless all night, worrying about her new job and her lost dog. A woman in her 40s was already bustling about in the spacious kitchen. "Are you Natalie? I'm Helen, the cook." She smiled good-naturedly. Everyone in the house seemed to be incredibly friendly. At 8 o'clock the couple came down. They were in good spirits. Natalie was a little nervous about preparing breakfast, but the smiles of approval from her hosts dispelled her uncertainty. At the end of breakfast, the maid asked if their daughter would be having breakfast. Wendy immediately frowned and sighed heavily. "Oh, I don't know. She seemed to have come back from the club again in the morning." The couple was saddened by the dissolute life of their child. They, formerly ordinary engineers who had started their business from scratch and knew the value of every penny, could not understand such an aimless, idle existence. At about 11 o'clock, Claire, the owner's daughter, came into the kitchen. She was about Natalie's age, a short, pretty young girl. Her brown, slightly curly hair framed her round face, shading her brown eyes. Cute, but not beautiful. "Ellen, what are we having for breakfast?" she asked instead of greeting, and then faltered when she saw Natalie. "Hello," she said. She looked at the maid from head to toe and smirked. Natalie didn't know what the girl's strange reaction meant. At breakfast, Claire watched her every move and suddenly said, "You're doing it all wrong. You're doing it all wrong." "I haven't worked in this position before, Claire, but I'm a fast learner. If it's not too much trouble, please give me a hint," Natalie said in a friendly manner, trying to establish a rapport with her. "My name is Claire," she said loudly, "and I don't have to tell you anything. You're supposed to be taught. Where do they teach you?" "Claire! Claire!" her mother exclaimed reproachfully as she entered the dining room. "How can you do that?" The daughter made a grimace and went into the parlor. The landlady followed her, and for some time she half-voiced something to the intemperate girl. Half an hour later, Wendy returned to give further instructions to her female employees. "Tomorrow night we must serve for 4, and we have a guest, Claire's young man. Ellen, let's go discuss the menu." The 2 days passed quickly in cares and troubles. It was only sad that the dog was still missing. "Natalie, we'll find him," Mary said cheerfully into the phone. In the evening of the next day, the long-awaited visitor arrived. The new maid opened the door and was stunned. On the threshold stood Ethan, the same, the former boss of her late husband. He was as surprised as the girl. They stared at each other in silence for a few seconds, until Claire jumped out from behind Natalie. She hung around the young man's neck, purring happily. She hissed at the negligent maid and said loudly to Ethan, "Honey, it's so hard to find a decent maid these days." All evening Ethan watched Natalie furtively. The tight, dark-colored uniform dress suited her well. "She's good, damn, not unlike Claire," he thought secretly. When the moment was right, he came up behind her and whispered in her ear, "You're even more beautiful now, Natalie," and touched his lips to her hair. Natalie shuddered, barely restraining herself from slapping him. "How so? Matchmaking with Claire and then hitting on me? What a sneak!" She even felt nauseous from the nasty guest. In the morning, she felt nauseous and dizzy again. All she needed was to get sick. At noon, the entire family and servants were gathered in the living room by the head of the family. He paced nervously from side to side, then stopped and said with a stern look, "I hate to tell you this, but a large sum of money has disappeared from the study." Everyone began to look around in surprise. Only Claire hissed angrily and pointed her finger at the culprit. What is there to think about? This never happened before. Until this. The unhappy maid shrank back, dizzy again. "If anyone has anything to say, they'd better say it now," John continued. Everyone remained dead silent. "Then we'll watch the footage from the video cameras together," the owner said decisively and leaned over the laptop. Everyone surrounded him from behind, watching the monitor with interest. The screen clearly showed how the door of the office opened, and on the threshold stood Ethan. With a thieving glance around, he walked over to the safe, carelessly tossed open, and pulled out a thick wad of money. After making sure there was no one in the hallway, he quickly exited as well. "Oh my God!" exclaimed a startled Wendy. No one could say a word. Claire, too, was silent, only biting her lip hard. The next morning, Helen whispered the latest news to Natalie. John called Ethan and promised him not to go to the police in exchange for an immediate refund. "No one wants to see you in this house anymore, Ethan," he added. The cook shook her head and whispered, "And Claire stayed in her room all night without going out. What a mean fiancé he turned out to be." Natalie listened half-heartedly, not feeling well again. The master had done a noble thing, but she didn't know if Ethan would appreciate it. It was fortunate that the young man's inclinations had come to light sooner than they might have. It is unlikely that now a two-faced thief will stay in this decent family. Apparently, the young man's father got tired of his son's outbursts and let him swim freely in life. So he decided to suck up to the family. Surprisingly, but the daughter of the owners even more began to hate the maid, as if she was to blame for the fact that the groom was a thief. Perhaps she just needed someone to vent her anger and despair on. The nagging became more subtle and hurtful. Claire tried to pick on every little thing. Natalie held on with all her might. That morning, Natalie overslept. She jumped up, looking at her watch in surprise. She felt dizzy again, and a bout of nausea drove her to the bathroom. Breathing out, the girl suddenly realized that this condition has been going on for 3 weeks. Just behind the worries, morning sickness went to the 10th plan. Looking at her female calendar, Natalie was stunned. The suspicion was confirmed. She was pregnant. A merry-go-round of thoughts danced in her head. What now? Do I tell the owners and give up the dream? Should she tell Andrew? Fright and confusion were replaced by quiet joy. The feeling that a little life now lived in her and her fate depended on her gave her determination. One must go right now and confess. By the way, why hasn't she been missed until now? In the living room on the couch with the phone in her hand sat the disconnected hostess. Next to her stood Claire with a worried look on her face. Ellen was running around with a glass of water and sedative drops. What's wrong? Wendy only now noticed her. She turned slowly and with naughty lips said quietly, "John has had an accident. He's been in a serious accident. He's in intensive care now." Seeing the confusion, Natalie went over to her hostess and took her by the shoulder. "What hospital? We have to go." The woman woke up at last, looked at the maid gratefully, and stood up. "Yes, of course, let's go quickly." Wendy took the front seat near the chauffeur. The others squeezed in behind. Claire, in spite of the feud, sat next to Natalie in the back seat. She adored her father. In the light of recent events, they didn't want to quarrel. At the hospital, a tired doctor came out to them. "The condition is critical. We need a blood transfusion. We cannot pick up rare phenotype and blood group," he said. "It is necessary to organize an individual selection in the blood service center. It's good that you are the whole family, so you have a better chance." We didn't explain anything, just found out the address of the center and without delay rushed there. Everyone gave blood, even the driver and Ellen, who was scared to death of injections. About half an hour later, the transfusiologist, a short gray-haired woman, came out to the waiting people. "Frolova Natalie, let's go for a blood draw." Claire jumped up and said loudly, "Woman, you've got it all wrong. My blood has to match." The doctor calmly looked at the paper in her hand from under her glasses and then at the boorish girl. "I didn't get anything mixed up. You and the recipient, judging by the results, are not even related. His blood type is type 3, his wife's is type 1, and yours is type 2. With these words, she led Natalie away, leaving the others to ponder the unexpected information. Claire was still indignant. No, they got something mixed up in there. A stunned Wendy sat in deep thought. How could this be? After all, in their long and happy married life, she and her husband had never cheated on each other. She knew for sure that the daughter was his. They drove back in silence. The next day, no one in the house remembered yesterday's incident. Only the landlady looked warily at Natalie. By evening, it became known that John's condition had improved after the blood transfusion. He was on the mend. This pleased the people of the house, and life began to return to normal. A little over a week later, the owner was still in the hospital, but was preparing to be discharged. Natalie had been waiting for this moment to confess her pregnancy. Suddenly, the hostess asked the maid to come to her in the living room. Wendy looked excited and disheveled, something she had never noticed before. "Natalie," she said, her voice breaking, "I've hired a private detective and ordered an investigation. I just got the report." The girl stared in surprise, not understanding anything, and the woman couldn't say a word and just silently handed her a folder with documents. Natalie ran her eyes over the sheet in bewilderment. Her maiden name flashed up and the girl delved into the report. It showed that almost 24 years ago, her mother and mistress had given birth on the same day, in the same maternity ward. The detective had to make a lot of effort to recreate the real events of those days. Somewhere he dug through the archives, somewhere he bribed someone. It turned out that on the night when Natalie was born, was on-duty nurse, who had recently died of her own child. Apparently, grief had taken its toll on the woman's mental health, so she switched Natalie and Claire. A month later, she was caught doing the same thing and kicked out without making a fuss. How many times she had done it was also not investigated, as it threatened the management with big trouble. That's how this long-standing secret came to light by accident. A pale Natalie was still sitting there, trying to comprehend the information. Everything was falling into place now, both the outward resemblance to her deceased parents and the unexpectedly easy spiritual closeness with the owners of the house. Wendy approached and said in a trembling voice, "Natalie, I'm your mother." She still couldn't utter a word. Excitement gripped her lips and her mind was a jumbled mess. My God, had she found her family again? Wendy couldn't stand it any longer and took her found daughter into a loving embrace. They sat hugging each other for a long time, sobbing heartily, in a woman's way. Claire was surprisingly quick to accept the unexpected news. Unable to find the right words, she walked over to Natalie and took her hand, her eyes expressing sincere remorse. "I'm sorry. I was a fool," she said. Those words were worth a lot to her. "I've always wanted a sister." Natalie smiled and scooped her up. To her, Claire was just a cranky grown-up child. The girls hugged each other and laughed through their tears. "We're like in an Indian movie." The father of the family was dumbfounded, but of course was happy to have found a blood child. The news of Natalie's pregnancy added to everyone's joy. The mother cried with happiness and joked, "God, there are more and more of us." The news quickly spread among friends and acquaintances. Andrew arrived, accompanied by Lori. When he was alone with Natalie, he knelt down in front of her and put her palm to his lips. "Natalie, I have never been able to forget you. I want to be with you and our child. How can I beg your forgiveness?" The girl was a little speechless. "I do not hold a grudge, but I cannot forgive you." Andrew listened without complaint and bowed his head. "I'm sorry, my love, for my past weakness. I will wait and hope." Lori was not like herself and kept silent all evening with a guilty look, and before leaving approached the newlywed. "Natalie, don't be angry with Andrew. It was my fault. I just couldn't believe that there were still selfless, decent people left in the world." Happy Natalie lay in bed and admired through the window the golden foliage against the soft blue October sky. Yesterday had been the most important event in her life. She had become a mom. The last few months of her life had been amazing. The only thing she regretted was the dog, a faithful friend irretrievably lost. Wendy flew into the room. The euphoria of a newfound grandmother was striking. She squeezed Max lightly and smiled. "Oh," she suddenly realized. "There's a couple of us waiting under the window," she said, asking to see Max. "Of course." The young mother happily agreed. She was proud of her baby. She wanted to inform the whole world about it. Another new human being was born, and she was involved in it. Wendy suddenly said with a serious face and a low voice, "Natalie, Andrew came too." She was silent, watching her daughter's reaction. "You should forgive him. He stayed with you the whole pregnancy. And if you knew what kind of work he did for you." Natalie raised her eyebrows in surprise as her mother continued, "People aren't perfect, Natalie. What matters is what conclusions they draw from it." Natalie went to the window and looked down. Her father and Claire were waving happily at her. Andrew was standing next to her, smiling embarrassedly and holding his dog in his arms.